Here we are. A little issue at the beginning, but we are back. And today we got a bit of light, bit of red fire for this episode because we are talking about something big and important. This is going to be really fascinating. So glad you're all here, glad you're all listening. As everyone knows, or for whoever might not, my name's Jason Sheftel. I'm an author, I'm a podcaster, I'm a consultant, I'm an attorney, and right now a lot of what I focus on is helping businesses figure out what's going on in the world, and when I have time, I educate everybody else using years of knowledge to just try and make some sense about what is going on in the world around us. And before I do that, I'm going to rearrange some of the lights behind me. Give me a sec. All right, we're back. That is a little bit more flair, but this is really fun. This whole studio is going to get built out. The content is going to get better and better, and I'm going to have more for you guys every week. So let's get right to it. Everyone right now is talking about inflation. This is one of the big stories in the world. It's everywhere. It's in the United States. It's in Europe. It's actually not so much in China, which we won't talk about today, but if you checked out the last episode all about real estate in China, that is where things are different. But inflation is the story all around the world. It is the worst it's been in most people's lifetime. Like, nobody can remember 9% inflation. Most people don't quite know what to make of it. A lot of your financial advice isn't going to really be able to talk about it. A lot of the correlations that we used to know about bonds, about certain inflation rates, certain interest rates, all of this stuff is really taking a beating. It's been taking a beating the last 10 years with what the Federal Reserve is up to, all sorts of stuff like that. It's a mess. We are really, as a world, building this whole economic machine while we fly, but we're experiencing some turbulence, some problems we haven't really experienced in a long time. And I don't mean the last 75 years, I mean way back. So here we are. I'm going to try and make some sense of this stuff for everybody. And before then, you guys, if you didn't see the last couple broadcasts, they were pretty awesome. There was really cool stuff about real estate in China. That's something you're going to want to know about. This is one of those asset categories that is just insane. I mean, this is a bubble like nobody's ever seen. Just, back when I was in China, I'm never going to forget taking a train literally from anywhere to anywhere else and seeing just absolute forests of apartment complexes, not even in major cities, but just like inside of, like on the side of a railroad. That's it. Beside the tracks, just endless apartments. It is a major story, and it's a real cool one. And there's a lot of stuff coming up. So before we get into this one, you got to know there's going to be stuff about industry, more about inflation and deflation. And once this economic bit is over, I'm going to get more to that other content people are looking for. Some of the history, war, development. Why do countries succeed? Why do countries fight? What does this mean for individuals? What does this mean for businesses? What about investors? What asset classes should we be looking at? What numbers should we really be paying attention to anymore? What really matters and what doesn't? That's what we talk about on this channel, because we're trying to figure out what happens next. What happens after all the stories that we've been told finally break down and we all see it. That is what we're going to do. And tonight, it's about the danger lurking behind inflation. I know this sounds crazy. I know it sounds crazy. It's a hard thing to grasp, but the real big story, let's say 5-10 years out, isn't going to be inflation. For most of the world, we're going to be talking about deflation. And this is another thing where, just like with stock and bond valuations, traditional currency correlations, certain things with the yen or the dollar, even the relationship between the price of oil and the U.S. dollar, which used to be they used to be inversely related. Even the fact that we have growth, economic growth, and inflation at the same time, a lot of this isn't what we planned for. This isn't the world we've modeled since 1970, and especially since the 1990s. So things are breaking down, and yeah, inflation and deflation are now going to go together, or at least one's going to come after the other. Right? They're not going to actually happen at the same time, and we're going to get into that because we're going to talk about what deflation is, what inflation is, break a little bit of this down for people who are just overwhelmed by all the financial talk. It's a little bit much, I get that, and let's do it. So the first thing to know about deflation, about all these inflations, is that we've been through this before. You go back through history, you'll find cycles of particularly inflation everywhere. You go back to the 1930s in Germany, that's a really popular one. You go to the 1970s in the United States. You can go on, and I'm talking about you can go back hundreds of years, go back 500 years, 700 years, 1200. It was a different era. We didn't have the tools, the technologies. It wasn't an industrial era. It was something very different. But inflation and deflation, they are monetary phenomenon in part. And so they've existed forever. And we'll get into the deepest causes of it. But the first thing to know is that the deflation that we're all going to see, this is an old story. This is the story of what happened to Japan in the 1980s and 90s. This is where you had crazy inflation in the 1980s. It was really crazy. It was, the the palace, the imperial palace in Tokyo was worth more than what was it? All of California. It was crazy talk. Japan, which is about the size of California, was worth 4 times, the land was worth 4 times the value of the United States. This is crazy inflation. And this is the crazy inflation actually that we've seen in a lot of the world, in a lot of asset categories, and in other episodes we'll talk about it. This is a huge part of why is actually demography. It's about a lot of young people gaining some money en masse and splurging all of it all around the globe. That's part of what's really going on. But back in the 1980s, after you had Japan being worth 4x the entire US landmass, you saw the collapse. And let me give you guys a quick video. Not even a video, let's give you a chart. Let's give you this chart. This is a chart of wages and prices. I know, so boring. Wages and prices in Japan, the year-over-year change, where you're comparing basically the consumer price index to total cash earnings in Japan. So basically, you're looking at it, huge. There's the inflation in the basically throughout the 80s, into the mid 90s, and then you get to around 1997, 98, and it all collapses. It collapses. And the truth is, there was a big hangover, so a lot of things were getting bad. They were collapsing by the early 90s. As you can kind of see, around 1990, it kind of falls, and it briefly gets back up due to a lot of government action, and then it falls again. But this is what you're seeing. This has been now over around 25 years of deflation in Japan. And as I said in the last broadcast, this was really a major deal. I mean, that graph you saw around 1996, that was the peak that Japan hit. Japan is smaller now, its economy, than it was back then. And a large part of this story is about deflation, because this is what happens. I was actually going to make a meme for you guys about an image of the Tokyo Palace and how this thing was worth all of California, but we won't do that. Instead, we'll just get into it. This is really not just a story of lost economic growth. This is a story of structural deflation. So what does that mean, and what is deflation? Because we're all talking about inflation, and deflation sounds kind of good, right? So, well, yeah, I mean, basically deflation is a fall in prices. And to everybody listening, that's probably great. I would prefer having cheaper aluminum foil and vegetables and gas and used cars. That's all true. Everybody wants lower prices right now. The problem is just why deflation happens. So deflation usually stems from a decrease in aggregate demand, basically the amount of stuff people want everywhere in the economy, all stuff, all goods and services. there's a decrease in that. There's a fall in that. Or there's an increase in the aggregate supply and all the stuff people are producing and providing and making, all the goods and services. So you basically can either have a huge amount more of the supply than you're expecting, writ large in the whole economy. That's what aggregate is about. In which case, well, there's so much of it that the prices fall. Or you can have a decrease in aggregate demand. And often it's kind of both, or over time usually will kind of tends toward both. So we're going to really kind of dive into this and really just kind of grapple with what this means. And I know everybody is thinking, who cares? Deflation. Dude, this is stupid. We're in a totally different world. Don't talk about this. You really got to remember, Japan, the thing to know about Japan is the place they got there first. Japan got to the future before the rest of the world. And a lot of things that seem so weird. Oh, Japan is so weird. Like back in the 1990s and 2000s, we thought they were so kooky and they were odd. And why aren't they more normal? Why are things so weird over there? They have these weird outfits. They have all this. Well, now look at us now. Look at TikTok. Look at the cosplay. Look at everything going on. And if you really think back, even socially, we are moving into a place that seems far more reminiscent of Japan 20 years ago. And for a lot of the world, this is what is going to happen in their economy as well. And a big reason why is because deflation is here. And deflation means less, well, deflation is coming really. And deflation, and I'll get to that in a minute, but first let's talk about what it does. And what deflation means is that there's just less demand for stuff, along with too much stuff. So you get cheaper prices, and then you start producing less stuff, and it leads to very bad spirals. So this is, let me give you guys a quick, let's pull up one. Okay, so I'll give you guys two. Here's the first one. I'll put myself in here too, so I can kind of talk about it. I really should get two cameras, and then I'd be able to give you guys the full story. But so let's talk about this. So basically, let's look at this. You start with falling demand, and then you get business losses. So when you have less demand, you have less people buying your goods and services. You have less customers to it. You have a smaller market, basically. People have less money. Whatever the reason is, there's less demand. So you have less cash flow, and then you have cheaper prices because you're trying to get some money, and then you have layoffs and wage reductions. So you're basically trying to survive, and you're doing what you can to lower costs to deal with the new level of demand. You're trying to acclimate your business to the new baseline. And then you have default and bankruptcies, and then you get falling tax revenues and increased debt burdens, and all of it turns into this spiral where you just get a cycle that produces less demand, which produces a fall in prices, which produces all these other problems, which leads to less everything, which leads to less demand, and just goes down and down and down and down. This is the death spiral, really, of a lot of countries. So people don't think about it a lot, but Japan, again, I'll keep talking about Japan because Japan got to the future first, and China's been doing everything possible to not end up like Japan. And it's going to end up worse than Japan. So understanding what happened in Japan, what the story really is really important. We've all kind of forgotten, but Japan, until like 2013, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. We're always focused on Europe and Germany and France and all these countries, but Japan has been a larger economy than them for over 50 years. It's not even close. It's a country that has just somehow faded off the radar. Part of it's because it's weird, it's odd, but it's also because of this deflation story. I'm gonna pull up another chart here. This one's a bit, I think, easier to look at. It's also just simpler. So, yep, lower price for goods and services, reduced profits and cash flow, reduced production, more unemployment, reduced spending, too many goods, lower prices, and there's the spiral again. It's just another spiral. There's a lot of ways to talk about this spiral. So often with inflation, you talk about the wage price spiral, where you have a larger, more difficult price environment. Everything costs more, so people need more money. So people try and get more money from their employers. So the employers raise wages, and that raises they're basically trying to meet the wages you need to deal with the increased prices. And that leads into a spiral where then suddenly people have more money, they're spending more, prices go up, and you get this wage price spiral. This is one of the problems that America saw in the early 1970s. That's a problem. But you also get a deflationary wage price spiral where everything just starts collapsing. And when deflation happens, I mean, this is bad. This means less stuff. It means just consistently less stuff, and you have less available to produce it. It really is. It is what it sounds like. Deflation is the economic balloon in a country literally deflating. That's what the title of this episode, this broadcast, is about. It is about how the era of more, of build more, bigger markets, bigger production lines, larger workforces, bigger raises, all of that ends. And we go to less production, less wages, less prices, less products, less services, less tax revenues, less profits, less everything, less economic activity, less business sales, less resource uses. It's just the end, right? And a lot of people on the hard left and some on the hard right welcome this. There's always been this urge, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, to improve our very resource-intensive form of industrial capitalism. Make it more suited to the world, make it more harmonious with the environment, make it more tailored to human emotional and social and psychological needs. That's been a goal. Unfortunately, the deflationary chaos that comes out and the deflationary death that you really get in an economy doesn't produce this. It actually creates problems, right? It's not like the capitalist machine is finally running dry and we can create a utopia, a more free, a more equitable land, if you're on the right or the left. You can't do that because you need stuff. You need funds to build all this stuff. To build the different world, you need the resources to build it. What you often see with deflation is managed decline. This is what a lot of, particularly, both actually economists on both sides, Lawrence Summers is a big one who talks about this on the left, where the experience of Japan for a lot of economists is a major influence. It is so stark, it is so incontrovertible that deflation has been a huge fear of a lot of countries for a really long time. Juicing the economy, doing quantitative easing, doing anything to prevent a total fall in aggregate demand. Big reason why this happened is Japan. And what you really see, and what the terrible story of Japan is that when you have deflation, it prevents anything new from being born. This is how countries and economies and societies die. And they die with a whimper. They die just with it all sort of withering away, because you can no longer expand anything. Think about if you're a business and you need to have bigger numbers by the end of the quarter. You need to have larger profits. You need to have a bigger top line, a bigger bottom line, new plans, grand expansions. How do you do that when the whole pie is shrinking? And let's be honest, how do you have a political system where the whole pie is shrinking? Everybody just starts fighting over what you have. It's a very dark place to be. There's never been a democratic system that has worked in that environment. We don't know. I mean, you look around the world, there's huge problems coming with inflation is basically crushing a lot of economies. And another episode will talk about that. Right now, for the people who are really interested, we're talking about the even greater threat that lurks behind it. The one that is even more of a problem for the advanced economies. Right now, a lot of places like Sri Lanka, North Africa, all sorts of places around the world, they're really struggling because they can't pay for anything anymore. Combination of a strong dollar with crazy inflation is crushing the ability of countries to not only keep their finances, fiscal house in order, to manage their monetary supply and their policies and interest rates well, it's also just making it hard to even function, to get the things you need to be a functioning country. So that is one thing, the chaos of inflation. And I've been talking about deflation, but the deeper thing here is why. Why is deflation so bad? So bad. That's the real question. And what is the cause of it? So there's all sorts of things, right? So what we're really asking is, why is the great machine of industrial capitalism finally slowing down? It's been going on for basically 500 years. Industrial capitalism. Why is it stopping? What happened in Japan? And there's a lot of answers. So like, if you go on the internet, you'll find all sorts of things. You'll see tight monetary policy, lower production or confidence or output or better technology. There's a bunch of things. I mean, here's a typical example of some stuff you'll say. And so you have fall in aggregate demand, and increase in aggregate supply. The truth is, the real inflation we're talking about is the demand-based one. That's the sort of structural, hard to ever deal with type that really matters. And where does that happen? Why does that happen? That is the question. And the answer, in a single word, is people. So, demographics. You're hearing more than ever a lot of people talking about not just the fertility crisis, but the population crisis and the decline of the human population all around the world. This has been the ticking time bomb that people have been talking about in articles and blogs and all sorts of stuff for literally 20 years, because we've known this. We have known this was coming. But for all the times you read a Wall Street Journal article or a Seeking Alpha article or a Financial Times article that talks about what might happen when populations shrink, or if anybody knows a bit about China and knows about the population, nuke that is embedded in its population structure right now, you hear about all this stuff, and it's all in the distance, it's all in the future, it's all what could happen when this finally happens. But the truth is, the future is now. The future is here. And we have deflation with a capital D, because the number of people in the economy, in these countries, in these industries, in the consumer market, it's all going down. And again, this happened in Japan first, but it's coming for the rest of the world. And that is why I'm talking about it, because this is one of the key themes of our lifetime. Is going to be depopulation, the aging and shrinking of the human population, particularly in the advanced industrial economies that create the modern world, that built and live in the modern world that we know. That's a huge story. And nobody's talking about it right. So Elon Musk right now is one of the people who has finally seen the data and is trying to wrap his head around what this means. Because the data is way worse than anybody wants to admit. Russia's lying about its data, China's lying about its data, and then Western democracies, and even Japan has been cheating. So how did Japan, which is shrinking like 1 million people a year, I think Russia as well is like 1 million people a year now, how did it manage to keep itself going even as well as it did? Well, part of the reason is because globalization allowed it to basically treat the rest of the world as if it was a big part of the Japanese population. It could sell to them, it could get resources from them. That allowed it to kind of keep its machine running. But that's also going. So other countries aren't going to be as lucky as Japan. And that's why the story of Japan and what happened is so important. It happened in a specific moment in time, demographically, economically, politically, internationally. All of this was a specific moment. So at some point I'm going to do either a broadcast or an in-depth video on Japan, because it's so important. I'm a China expert, and the focus in China for a very long time has been to make sure they beat Japan. Make sure China beats Japan. It's very important. Japan was for decades, really, and basically since the Meiji Revolution and its imperial conquest, Japan has been seen as the major player in East Asia, particularly Northeast Asia, and China never liked that, and it wanted to have faster trains, more impressive cities, better factories, all of that. Japan was really the place that it looked to, particularly early on. Then it really concentrated more on the United States, especially in its own neighborhood, and with China's specific history, it's all been about Japan. And it makes sense. Japan was number 2, and that was what China needed to pass before it could approach the United States. So that is what we need to focus on. And one of the things I'm going to be doing in a lot of these broadcasts is trying to bring a bit of the truth about what we need to know about demographics. And I'm not going to get into this social policy and stuff like that, because the truth is there's no great answers. No country that is either trying to encourage more births has succeeded, and no country that has really tried to force more births has succeeded. So there is not much to talk about there. Well, there's a lot to talk about, but we're going to focus on the core practical things that really matter. And the way the population balloon deflates, taking the economic advance of mankind with it, is you first get a big burst of inflation when the bulge in your population, that last active, vital, large population cohort rises up. It goes from being a teenager to being a 20-something, a 30-something, a 40-something that has it made and is paying off all his debts and has a family and has high income and gets to their 50s and God, they're still making money, and finally they get into their 60s and then they retire, and then it all seems to shrink away. And that's what we're going to see. And once you lose your consumers and then your investors and producers, when you lose them, when they're gone from your economy, that is when you really experience deflation. And usually that's the end. Japan has never been better than it was in the 90s. You could say it's kind of a better life. Individually, you might have a better lifestyle. But the great force of mankind, of industry, of whatever you want to call it, the progress of civilization, you can call it whatever you want, that started to end. Excuse me. And if you did not have the rest of the world, the story in Japan would look far darker, far grimmer. And unfortunately, in this world we're going to enter with smaller, less dynamic economies that have less growth and smaller markets, it is going to be a lot darker. So let's get into it. One of the real problems with inflation and deflation, all these monetary phenomenon, is the psychology that goes along with it. What happens to our brains and how we react and the choices we make. It's a really big thing. And just like inflation is affecting everything. It's affecting what jobs you take, what purchases you make, what trips you take, all of that. Deflation does the same thing. I mean, the same way that you do, your relationships get disturbed, there's tensions, your governments get damaged, goods and services are unaffordable. You get the same thing with deflation, but it's worse. What really happens is everything grinds to a halt. Consumption stops because why not wait for cheaper prices? You're not going to have as much money, but you might as well wait for it to fall. Investment stops because why invest in things when the markets are going to be smaller? We don't have an answer for that question. There is no economic answer to why to invest if your market is going to be smaller. We don't have an answer for that. 20 years later, there's no answer. And what you need, what ends up happening, and what is required is for the government to eventually step in, make up the difference. You have less consumption, you have less business investment, a lot of things that are part of GDP, you have less exports, you have less imports, you have less everything. The government is forced to take a huge role in the market. And people were very worried about that in the early 2010s when we had, particularly in the United States, the massive intrusion or the entrance of the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, into a lot of financial markets, into bonds, into mortgages. It was a big change. But you look at Japan. Japan has 40% of its bonds are basically owned by the Bank of Japan. You enter a world when you have deflation where the government is forced to take an even larger structural role in the economy. And there's no real way to stop that. Again, you could have a strong private sector. If we want to talk about the benefits of entrepreneurship and free enterprise, all of this stuff, it only works if you have bigger, dynamic, effective markets. If you have shrinking markets, what do you do with kind of disturbed price signals? What do you do? Well, the system we know doesn't work, and we don't know what to do. We've seen what Japan did, which is basically get the government to come in and try and focus on lifestyle. That's something. But growth is gone. Optimism is over. That is what deflation creates. That's the world it creates. And that is the world that most countries are just blindly stumbling into, just walking right into. We're all so focused on inflation, which again, we should be. It's crazy. It is a difficult thing to wrap our heads around when we haven't experienced it. We've actually been in a world of deflation, or disinflation, you could say, where the former Soviet Union, all of the inputs it gave to the world, energy, metals, minerals, fertilizers, agricultural products, all of this stuff lowered prices. The entrance of hundreds of millions of particularly Chinese workers into the global economy to help produce finished goods and services, particularly goods, further reduced prices. Really cheap shipping all over the world, further reduced prices. And as you can see, all that is starting to unwind. And so inflation's going crazy. But the deeper, even more important force is how big are the markets in the world. And if every single major nation's population starts to shrink, you don't have dynamic economies anymore. You have structurally smaller ones. And the story for a long time in the era of globalization was that the new countries in Africa and Latin America and South Asia, all this would change things. The Middle East, the whole world would be able to stabilize everything because there's more and more people and you bring them into the economy. Truth is, the era of developing nations is over. If you haven't developed at this point, you're probably not going to develop. And a lot of nations that have developed are going to stop developing because the conditions are gone. So you're not going to be able to get the new consumers, the new investors, the new producers, the new laborers from the rest of the world, from most of the rest of the world. Some parts will be okay to some degree, but most of this story is the story of the rich countries losing their mojo. And there's not much to know about whether this is happening or not. The math is very simple. You're going to have less 20-somethings, less 30-year-olds, and then less 40-year-olds. You're going to have less of everybody soon. And soon enough, it'll be like China in a couple decades where China's going to have almost all old people. It's going to be like a ridiculous ratio of the over 65 to young workers. And that is where we're heading. So this is the story of deflation. This is the story behind the story. Right now we have a lot of inflation because we have the breakdown of globalization. And we actually have a lot of inflation as well because of problems we're getting due to the population problem, the depopulation issue. So as all of our very mature workers, very experienced, very knowledgeable, very skillful, very high value workers start to retire, their money goes with them. We don't have money to replace it yet, not for a long time, not for a few years. So that's what's happening. And this is the terrible story, but all is not lost, right? I'm not here to just be doom and gloom. The reason most of these broadcasts are a little difficult to swallow, they have all this grim material, is because in the world of consulting, in the world of a lot of international business, in the world of even startups and internet technology, and all these places where we have optimism. Optimism is super important, but you can't just have this fake optimism. You can't have these hype cycles. There's really great technologies that are coming that can change a lot of things. There are advances we can't even imagine yet, but we also can't just project out current trends, or at least a lot of technological ones. You definitely can project out demographic trends. Some things are really set in stone. But we just can't have these blind beliefs in things. All these crazy consulting reports that just want to talk about the next billion here and the advances of AI in Africa and all this stuff. You can't buy this anymore. You need something real. And there's no good way to do this if you're just going to drink that terrible Kool-Aid. But I am going to do a broadcast about the technologies that matter, what can really happen to make this work. So that's the focus, right? We want to know what asset categories, what technologies are the ones to bet on. What are the ones that can actually deal with all of these crazy structural forces, that can deal with the breakdown of a global system that's been around for 75 years, or the breakdown of a population structure that has basically been building up since the agricultural revolution like 10,000 years ago. These are real tough questions. And it's another thing where you can't just expect a simple technology to fix it. This is not something that a chat app can fix, right? The same way that no technology is fixing inflation. To deal with that crazy, lurking, horrible threat of deflation, that is going to be even more difficult. So it's something to really keep in mind. So definitely check out the coming broadcast. We're going to have another episode about deflation, what it means, and how, if you want to be one of the people that has that foreknowledge of what's coming and can really see a little farther into the future and can prepare right now so you can play the swings of current inflation, whatever is happening with that, see where the breakdown's happening, but also know where things are headed. You really get a leg up, and you really get to know where to invest your energies, because a lot of energy is just going to be dissipated. A lot of money's just going to be burning up. And so it's good to know where things are headed. That's really important. Other really cool stuff is coming. This episode was much more about economics, but there's cool stuff coming about industry. We're going to talk about what the breakdown of industry in Europe really looks like. Because there's a great thing coming about Britain, about the final attempt, and basically how Europe is not going to be able to even build a fighter jet anymore. They've totally lost the capacity. And the whole industrial conglomerates that make European defense sectors and a lot of their major hard industries work, all that is really struggling. I'm not even talking about Germany not able to make chemicals or tanks or any of that. This is even deeper. So we'll get into it, but with that, I'm done. If you enjoyed this, let's get the engagement up, throw some likes, get ready, subscribe. There's really cool stuff. I'll definitely throw up all these socials now. You guys can't forget, you gotta subscribe. Definitely check out TikTok, you gotta check out Twitter, you gotta check out Instagram. There's cool stuff on all there. TikTok in particular, a lot of fun. A lot of short stuff, it gets thrown on here as shorts, but I got to use the big breakout Chinese company that really is changing everything. It's forcing Facebook to change its news feed. In a lot of ways, this is going to be what I think is the last major Chinese consumer company to make this splash. So kind of like what was that great series that's being made into a Netflix series? Cixin Liu. Oh, The Three Body Problem. Just like that is really cool. People should check it out. Get ready for the series. There's two. There's a Netflix one. There's a Tencent one. TikTok is something we're going to want to have fun with while it's here, while it's around, while everything in China is okay. Actually, before I go, let me see if I can show you guys something. Obviously, I can't keep up with every single thing going on in China. It's too much, but what I can, yeah, there's the TikTok again. Let's see if I can throw you guys a quick bone, show you what is happening in China right now. Out in Shandong province, we have a boom. Let's look at this. So give me a second here. Yeah, let's get this on. So this is Shandong. Actually, no, this is the actual city. These is on the photo, so you can see right now easily a little shady. But what you're seeing is the sort of camera, by the way, that you should have a much better camera. But this is Shandong province. This is eastern China, a peninsula near the Yellow Sea, et cetera, et cetera. These are tanks that are supposedly out there because they are trying to prevent people from taking their money out of banks. There is a massive crisis going on in China right now due to the structural importance of property in that country. So I have another video on it. Check out the recent broadcast. It's about China and the whole Chinese real estate sector. And I kind of go into it, and there's a couple technical issues and stuff. We're still building this whole broadcast as I fly. It's really important. It's like a third of the Chinese economy, and it means a lot. You start getting deposits, you start getting people to pull things out of banks. The Chinese financial system, which is a mess, there's probably been no financial system in the history of the world that really looks anything like on the ground what the Chinese one looks like. It's way beyond anything reasonable. It's really starting to crack, and there's all sorts of stories we're going to get into. I'll try and do a few more broadcasts, but you guys, I always appreciate everybody here. Everyone who knows, again, I do business consulting. I've been in geopolitics for 3 years now, background 12 years, been around the world, South America, Europe, particularly Asia and China, to figure out why the world works. And now as it breaks down, I'm sharing that knowledge to help businesses and individuals try and find their way through all of this. So with that, I'm going to leave you guys, and I will see you next time.